Testing 1 2. Okay, I'll spot it.
Excellent. All right. Good evening, everyone. We want to welcome you back to our final session for Saturday night, which is going to be a very engaging panel. Again, it is our most religiously diverse panel. We're very, very excited. We're going to get right into it in just a moment. Just want to remind you that this is not the final event. We have plenty more content for you. Remember, there's a network session later tonight. We'll give you a little bit more details about that before we get started. In addition to that, we are going to have some programs tomorrow. We have a panel tomorrow, a youth panel, talking about youth activism and how individuals can get involved. And we have some students, rather, I should say, student panel from Yale University and Princeton Theological Seminary. And then we also have a charge given to us by none other than Claudia Allen, who is a very engaging and dynamic youth speaker of the Adventist Church. And you don't want to miss that presentation. It's going to be very well presented. Just a quick point on the networking session that's going to be happening tonight. I have to apologize. The link that was sent out at the very end of last session was not the link that will be used for the networking session this evening. That was actually the link, in case you lost it in your email, for the session that we are currently in at this moment. What we've done is we've just added in a new Zoom link into the chat, and that is the link that you will use to enter the networking session at 7:15/7:20 tonight, right after this panel, if you are interested in. Again, what we're going to do is we're just going to invite people into a normal Zoom meeting. You'll be able to see the faces of other attendees. In addition to that, we'll have a few breakout questions and a few discussions to get everyone talking with each other, thinking about the conference, sharing people's thoughts, and hopefully be able to exchange some contact information as well, just so we can network. So if you're interested in that, save that link in the chat right now so that you'll be prepared and ready for that. We also want to take a moment to just recognize again that we are a very diverse crowd, and so as we like to do, if you are coming from really wherever you're coming from, we just invite you to put your location down in the chat. We've seen some very unique locations over the weekend, everyone from Romania to India to Brazil. Just go ahead and use the Q&A feature. Tell us where you're coming from so that we can acknowledge you. If you're in the room right now, just go ahead and put in the chat where you're coming from. Um, and why don't you just put one word in the chat as well that describes how you're feeling about the conference thus far? You know, what are the thoughts? What are the emotions that are coming in? So if you can just use the Q&A, go ahead. Okay, I see El Paso, Texas. I see Indiana. Yeah, so just put your location and how you're feeling. West Palm Beach, Brian Young, wow, is his reaction. We have someone from Atlanta, Georgia, Indianapolis, excited. Katie Lee, excited from Sacramento, California. Atlanta, Georgia, awesome information. Brazil, feliz. From Alagoas, Brazil, I'm feeling so blessed. Kevin Eric from Washington, informative. Brazilian in New Jersey is astonished. That's Vanessa, Atlanta, Georgia. Awesome information. Carla Catalupo, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, enlightened. And then we also have um, from Mayaguez, Puerto Rico. One of our interpreters is coming in from all the way from Puerto Rico. We have Agata coming from Romania. Blessed. Wow. So I agree with you. I don't know if there's a word in the English language to put all these emotions and words together. Maybe I ought to use ineffable. It can't be described in words. That's how I'm feeling about this conference. It's such a blessing to have all these voices together, and we know that we're going to continue to be blessed and to be educated on these issues and to be inspired and equipped to go out and make change. So we are very, very excited and grateful and blessed. So let's get right into it now. Oh, just one more point. If you want to keep following along with us, both now during the conference and then also afterwards, don't forget to follow us at our Instagram page. That's going to be Yale ACF, YALE ACF on our Instagram page. You can also find us on Facebook at Yale Adventist Campus Fellowship. We have a Facebook page as well. There you can find just a little bit more information about again, the conference for this weekend, but we'll be updating that with more information about what we're doing as a fellowship going forward and as a campus organization. So again, that's Yale ACF at Instagram and Yale Adventist Campus Fellowship on Facebook. So be sure to follow us there. Um, Again, just for practical purposes, if you need the schedule, there should be a post about the schedule, and a little bit more information about our speakers should be listed on there as well. So feel free to check that out. So now, without further ado, we want to go right into our panel today. I were just talking with them in the break room earlier, and they are excited. They actually want to cut down their presentations a little bit shorter so that they can have more time to engage and talk with you all and talk on the conversation. So we are excited, and we know it's going to be great. Let's go ahead and introduce our moderator, a great friend of ours and beloved professor here on Yale's campus, Professor Abdul Rahman Malik. Abdul Rahman Malik is an award winning journalist and cultural organizer currently serving as a lecturer and associate research scholar at the Yale Divinity School. Abdul Rahman also serves as director of the Muslim Leadership Lab, an innovative student leadership program being incubated right here on Yale's campus at the Dwight Hall Center of Social Justice. Abdul Rahman is a frequent journalist for BBC Radio, offering contemporary perspectives on contemporary spirituality. And we know that he's going to bring his and journalistic experience here to this conference as he moderates our discussion today. We're really excited. At this point, we're going to turn it over to him, and he is going to introduce the rest of our panels. Again, is a very diverse, religiously diverse panel. Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and Buddhism all represented in one room. Very excited. Professor Malik, on to you.
Hello, Guilherme, Stephen, and friends. Thank you so much for the invitation tonight, and welcome to all of you who have joined us from around the country and around the world. Tonight's panel, I think, is an important one, and I think given the broader context in which this conversation has been taking place over the last day, I think we arrive at this point in the conversation at the right time. The title, as all of you know, is The Religious Responsibility in Criminal Justice. But I think what we're going to be doing tonight is going deep into the traditions that are represented around this virtual discussion table. For each, we're going to first have a chance and give a chance to each of our guests to kind of set the scene from their perspective, from their expertise. Around this table, we have professors, we have practicing religious leaders, we have movement builders and movement makers, we have formerly incarcerated individuals who have done incredible work at quote unquote criminal justice reform within and without the system. They bring all of these experiences to the table through their theology and through their spirituality. And that's going to be an important motif for me tonight to explore, is to understand how our own theologies, how our own spiritualities reckon and come to terms with the reality of the carceral state, with the realities of mass incarceration, and with the movement of the moment. Which is questioning in the most profound and systematic way the whole edifice of mass incarceration and that carceral state. I'm going to introduce each of them and then allow them to kind of jump into the conversation and then move on to introduce the next one. So we'll introduce everyone in turn. Everyone has a generous amount of time to develop their thoughts and their position. Some of them will be sharing screens, and then what we'll do is we'll bring the group together and try to piece out the threads of the various positions that have been presented. I want to start by introducing Dr. Ebony Cunningham Stringer, Dr. Cunningham Stringer is an assistant professor of criminal justice at Penn State University. Her interests include maternal incarceration, gender and crime in the role of clergy, and religious institutions and social and criminal justice initiatives. Her work has been published widely. She has a background in sociology, political science, and Black studies, and did her doctoral degree from Purdue University in the Department of Sociology. In our discussions yesterday, because the panel had a chance to come together yesterday over a cup of coffee, Dr. Cunningham Stringer is also deeply engaged in the work of religious leadership and of pastoral work and of ministry. So in a unique way, Dr. Cunningham Stringer, you bring together these two different worlds, the world of academia and research and analysis and the work of religious leadership. We are so excited to have you with us, so honored. And I'm going to turn the floor over to you, Dr. Cunningham Stringer, for the first of our 4 presentations.
Thank you.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Over me, and before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my own grave, and go home to my Lord and be free.
I didn't plan on being incarcerated so my mom could raise my kids. I wanted to raise them, but evidently I was doing something too fast. You know, through incarceration, God sat me down for a second. I was doing something wrong. I'm not happy to be here, but I'm here for a reason. And having my baby here, I never experienced nothing like that in my life. I had a C-section, so I had her for 2 days after she was born. I was fine and great till I knew that I was getting ready to leave. And that's when all hell broke loose. They have a certain time to pick up the babies, or she doesn't go with the caregiver. She can be turned over to a state agency for neglect. Well, it's about 10 minutes to the deadline, and the baby's father still ain't there to pick up the baby. So I'm about to freak out. I took the baby in the bathroom with me and I prayed to God. I said, you know, I put this situation in your hands. I know everything gonna be all right. Then here the baby's father, go with more than enough stuff. He brought 2 car seats. He had white clothes and blue clothes. He was so excited. He brought everything but the diapers. That was the thing that made me believe that God does answer prayer, because I was really nervous about the baby. But there he was, right on time. With my middle boy, when we write each other, it's like we're praying. We're praying, we're praying. I'm still praying, Mama. And I tell him, I'm still praying. And I tell them all to keep their heads in the Bible. Constantly, I let them all know that I love them. I'm sorry, but this will pass. We're gonna be out there playing ball and football, so don't put them up. I just keep on telling them, just keep going. You may be a couple years older, but I'm gonna get home. Keep having the faith. These are the words of Krista and Nicole, two African-American mothers I interviewed, caged in a Midwest prison for women. And tonight I wanted to bring their voices into our Zoom room. Let me say good evening to all of you, kindred, God's children, and my spiritual siblings. I published an article some time ago called Keeping the Faith that centered the voices of African-American women like Krista and Nicole. And in this study, I was seeking to understand women's maternal experiences in carceral spaces. I remember being struck by the ways that women's religion and spirituality echoed throughout their narratives. Prison separated children from the only home and caretakers they'd known and from their siblings, traumatized them in ways from which it is hard to heal, dehumanized them in ways unimaginable. And after all of this, when these women wept for their children, because as one woman named Dale said, they're not getting the love of their mother, the women may be told, you should have thought about that before you came to prison. Rape, medical neglect, denial of feminine hygiene products, verbal abuse. These and other deplorable conditions women lived through. And when they took it all in, summed it all up, many concluded that their imprisonment was a divine intervention. What kind of world do we live in when the only way to save a woman from certain death is prison? What kind of world do we live in when a woman's only reprieve from an abusive pimp or lover is prison? In what civilized nation is a woman's only escape from poverty and trauma and sexual abuse and joblessness and homelessness and hopelessness and orange jumpsuit and identification number from the state? This is not justice. This is not moral. And this most certainly is not God's doing. The fact is that society, empire, has concocted with some intentionality this trauma, with people caught in the carceral web believing that it is they who wove the web themselves. Krista says I was moving too fast. I did something wrong. But in reality, Krista and Nicole are cogs in a system that operates exactly as it was intended. And in the words of Dr. Ibram Kendi, they were stamped from the beginning. I come to this work as one trained in the discipline of sociology, and I'm very attentive to the structures, patterns in social life, and the ways in which history informs our biography. And I'll talk about some of that this evening. My research centers women's carceral experiences and the roles of religious institutions in justice reform. But I also come to this work as an ordained clergy member, steeped in the ways and traditions of Black church, and with a deep prophetic hope and faith that we can, all of us, get free. Now, I'm gonna try not to get too churchy tonight, but if I do, at least you have some context. And it's also worth mentioning that I bring about 15 years of prison ministry to my experience. And this evening, I've entitled my introductory remarks, Why We Must Be Prison Abolitionists, a call to action for the Black church, and all of our friends of faith are invited to. Today, the incarcerated are transported on buses and vans and such, but my ancestors arrived on ships incarcerated, freedom stripped from them. And we were inserted into the losing end of an exploitative yet most profitable economic system called chattel slavery. Moved by their faith and convictions about divine justice and freedom, the Black church, many of us call them abolitionists, but I'm talking about Mother Harriet Tubman, Deacon Frederick Douglass, and preacher Sojourner Truth, and others who took an active and leading role in the abolition project. But we know that slavery, culturally entrenched, didn't merely go away with the 13th Amendment. Instead, it morphed itself into sharecropping, and with an infamous loophole in the 13th Amendment, prison farms, the convict lease system, chain gangs, all of which emerged with the intention to exploit Black bodies and extract profits for their labor. The current prison industrial complex that is fed and nurtured at the bosom of mass incarceration is but the latest iteration of chattel slavery. As such, dismantling the prison industrial complex, PIC, is the unfinished work of abolition. The Black church and Black spirituality has been on the front lines of almost every major justice movement in the United States. But around the issue of dismantling the PIC, the silence is too often deafening. Now, Pastor Heron Gaston has laid out for us with great thoroughness the statistical context, but let me remind us of a few. 1 in 3 Black men will be imprisoned in their lifetime, compared to 1 in 17 white men. 1 in 18 Black women will be imprisoned in their lifetime, compared to 1 of every 111 white women. 7.4% of African Americans are disenfranchised. 433 per 100,000 of Black youth receive residential placement or juvenile detention, compared to 86 of every 100,000 of their white counterparts. These numbers demonstrate that incarceration disproportionately targets Black communities. These are our children, our mothers, our uncles, our daddies, our brothers. These are our church members. It should be said quite plainly that we must do something. Now, I've noticed that many Black churches don't mind doing prison ministry, and that was mentioned earlier today. We will come into that prison with our keyboards and our tambourines and our Bibles. We will sing your soul happy. We will preach your soul out of hell and eternal damnation. And afterwards, we pack up our Bibles, unplug our keyboards, take our tambourines, and we leave satisfied knowing that we have ministered to souls without a second thought about the caged body left behind. Not a thought about that body being plundered, suffocated, denied. You see, we make a distinction between the body and the soul. But for the living, this can be a false dichotomy. For the living, our souls are embodied in flesh. And what happens to our bodies very much concerns our soul. So to keep the body caged is also to incarcerate the soul, and it cannot flourish as it should. This is not justice, and this is not God's doing. In modern times, we've seen the church take a public stance and initiate movements around many issues, right down to who people choose to love or sleep with. And that's fine, take your stance. But I think it's worth noting that the Bible has over 1,000 mentions of justice. And this is more frequent than what we see in with regard to other topics. For instance, sexuality is only referenced about 90 times, justice 1,000 times. The implications here is that maybe, just maybe, God is more concerned with justice than he is who we are sleeping with. Justice is God's character. And for those of us who claim to be made in his image, it only follows that we should emulate the character and adopt the priorities and social agenda of our leader and visionary, Christ Jesus. Justice is at the heart of who God is and what God does. And God is on the side of the oppressed. Now, according to Chris Marshall, biblical justice entails 2 things that I want to mention. One is righteousness. Justice in the biblical sense entails righteousness. That is to say, it entails setting things right and in order, righting that which is wrong. Incarceration brings in a lot of money, and it brings a lot of pain and trauma to the incarcerated and those who are punished alongside the offender, children, and community. But it does not make things right. It doesn't make things better. We have overwhelming evidence that, in fact, it makes things worse. And there's an entire economy banking on that fact. Second, biblical justice brings shalom. And that's not just the absence of negativity and chaos. Shalom entails wholeness, health, prosperity. Shalom restores balance and harmony. It is a state of flourishing in relationship with God and others. Prison does not bring shalom because there can be no justice where there is no peace. No justice, no peace. Knowing what we know about the absence of righteousness and shalom from our current system, we have some added context about what we know about recidivism rates. That 67% of people released will return to the prison industrial complex within 3 years. How broken people are if and when they leave prison. I'm thinking now of our dear brother Khalif Browder, tortured for 2 years because he wouldn't confess to a crime he didn't commit. Eventually, the charges were dropped. He got to tell his story to the world, but he never got shalom. Things were never made right for him. He never got justice and took his life at the age of 22 years old. Justice is God's idea. That idea has been hijacked and morphed into something that God does not recognize. Those who follow God must learn from him what justice means and reproduce what they learn in all of their activities in the world. Justice is biblical, not political. The Black church and all believers must actively close the gap between the institutional church and their God when it comes to justice. We must bridge the social distance between the church and society and our brothers and sisters in chains who comprise the church on the inside. We must be repairers of the breach because they are us and we are them. Can you hear Sister Nicole saying as she writes to her son that she has not been permitted to see for 3 years? It's like we're praying, we're praying, we're praying. I'm still praying, Mama. And I tell him, I'm still praying. And can you hear the ancestors pick up the chorus and say, pray on just a little while longer. Pray on just a little while longer. Pray on just a little while longer. Everything is gonna be all right. Did you hear that? That prophetic hope, that confident expectation of a better and brighter future. This is our call to action. Present injustices must not be tolerated or accepted as inevitable. We are to work with God for greater realization of justice in the here and now. And we do believe that there is coming a time at the end of this age that God will execute final judgment on this earth. But Marsh tells us God's coming justice is the culmination of, not a substitute for, human endeavors for greater justice in the here and now. Let me end by saying this. Many of us Christians are in the Lenten season. We're fasting from designer coffees and social media and sugar and fried foods. And we do this as a frail attempt to identify with the humiliating and gruesome death that Christ experienced to pay for our freedom. And that's good. Give up your coffee and your cake pops and your Instagram account. But there's another fast that God requires. Isaiah 58:6 says, is not this the kind of fasting that I have chosen to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke. We cannot continue to call upon prisons to do the restorative work that needs to be done in our communities. Justice handed down from prisons does not set things right, nor does it bring shalom, peace, balance, and harmony. It is not life-giving. It is rotten at its root. So let us uproot it, dismantle the PIC, and with it chattel slavery once and for all. I want to see the Black church advance efforts that lead to divestment from prisons and all of its pipelines and tributaries, including under-resourced schools, poverty, abuse, addiction, and violence. Let us make room and more room for freedom and justice for all. Mama Katie Staten says, let us make room for justice. Let us make room for justice that restores. Mama Fannie Lou Hamer says, nobody is free until everybody is free. Mama Ella Baker declared, and it is true, we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it happens. This is why we must be prison abolitionists. This is a call to action for the Black church, and all of our friends of faith are invited too.
Oh, don't you know? No more weeping. No more weeping over me. And before I just in my own way.
Ashe and amen.
Thank you, Dr. Ebony Cunningham Stringer. That was breathtaking in its scope and its call to divine action. And you have begun with a clarion call to justice, which I'm now going to ask our other panelists to also pick up. I wanted to introduce now Rabbi Lydia Medwin. Rabbi Medwin currently serves at the Temple, one of the foundational synagogues in Atlanta, Georgia, as the director of congregational engagement and outreach. She has also helps lead the Rothschild Social Justice Institute. Rabbi Medwin, as she was speaking to us yesterday, was describing to us how she has been part of a national initiative to put together a multi-faith initiative to end mass incarceration. It's a formal initiative that was launched with the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church and the Auburn Seminary. Rabbi Lydia Medwin was ordained at the Hebrew Union College, where she received her Master's of Hebrew Letters and a Master's in Jewish Education. And one of the things that struck me, Rabbi, as we were speaking yesterday, was how in this moment where Dr. Ebony is calling us to become prison abolitionists and to join the movement and to be part of something greater, that, you know, I'm reminded by our conversation yesterday that you are engaged in that very movement building right now across faith and confessional lines. So looking very much forward to these opening remarks from you this evening. The floor is yours, Rabbi Medwin.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. It's just wonderful to be here with you all, imagining your beautiful, precious souls out there sitting, listening, caring, hopefully also feeling moved to action as I am by Dr. Cunningham Stringer's remarks. Thank you so much to Mpila and Guilherme and Stephen and your whole team for all of your incredible work, and congratulations. And it's just such an honor to have met Professor Malik, Dr. Jones, Dr. Cunningham Stringer, and Teacher Mo. And I'm grateful to know and meet all of you and consider you new colleagues in the work of redemption and liberation. I'm truly humbled to join this esteemed crew. I want to start with just a few stories that I have been honored really to hear over the past few weeks. You know, the religious imperative to listen to story, to tell story, right? It's the most human way that we communicate with one another, the deepest of truths. And so I offer these stories as a way to begin my comments and root them in the work that is very real and very ongoing today. The first is just down the road from Columbus, Georgia, where I spoke to an organizer and formerly incarcerated woman there who told me the story of 600 men who are working today without pay for the city government, resulting in a net profit for the city of $15 million, while the city's citizens are suffering from unemployment. Instead of investing in its citizens, the city has decided instead that modern slavery is both easier and perhaps politically advantageous. Just a couple of days ago, I spoke to a pastor and a mother of an incarcerated son who showed up every 2 weeks for every city council meeting from March until November of this past year in 2020, until the county finally stopped charging her son 5 cents every time he picked up one of those tiny salt packets to try to make the food that was already not nutritious into something edible. They decided, this county, that it's okay to create moment after moment of dehumanization for people who currently sit in jails and prisons. She later told me that the same's true for salt, for mustard, ketchup, everything that you could imagine, charging people extra for. And lastly, with the heaviest heart, I share the news that one of my colleagues from our national strategy team of the Multi-Faith Initiative to End Mass Incarceration, Pastor Zachary, lost her son, Blake Lee Zachary, 3 months ago. At first, they told us that it was because of COVID that had been running rampant in the prison. He had felt some symptoms for weeks and had not been addressed. Later, when we raised enough money to help her get an autopsy for her son, we're now wondering from the evidence of that autopsy if actually something more sinister was happening. And finally, a last story, I'll just add my own. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee in the 1980s. And when I got caught underage drinking and I got arrested, do you know what happened to me? Nothing. Nothing happened, except all of the things that white supremacy has taken from me over my lifetime. My compassion for people, my ability to create relationships with people whom I might really love. Thank God today I'm on a journey to reclaim myself and redeem my own tradition. But it does, all of these stories, I think, bring into sharp focus the real responsibility that we as people of faith should feel when it comes to criminal justice reform. From a Jewish perspective, it's really quite simple. There's the world as it is, and there's the world as it should be. And there's a vision of what is in between. There's a gap. And where tradition gets to turn from a noun into a verb, urging us to pull those two worlds into one, such that the world as it is and the world as it should be are one and the same. I'm going to share a couple of thoughts on where the traditions lands on some of these major issues. And it starts from the very title of this conference, inspired like so many other movements and gatherings before by that phrase from Exodus 5, let my people go. This was the phrase that took the Jewish people from a collection of tribes into one unit, into one people under the same God. This notion that we deserve freedom, that we are created free, and that anyone, anywhere who is not free is our responsibility as religious people. And it leads us to this question of why? Why in the world do we continue to need to pursue justice? And that's because it seems to be elusive. Justice is running all the time away from us. And our job in working toward a world as it should be is constantly one step ahead. We have to continue always to focus our attention as religious people towards places where injustice occurs and try to chase down that justice to make it live in our own time. And when we wonder what God has to do with this conversation, we understand that God And God understands God's self, right? As this creator, this being who has called us to righteousness, who has taken us by the hand, who has given us a covenant, a light into the nations, to do what, right? What is this covenant essentially about? It's to open the eyes of the blind, to help people who currently cannot see the truth of a situation to do so. And at the same time, to bring out prisoners from the dungeon, from people who are sitting in darkness. And that is the essential problem with this moment. The essential theological problem, in my view, is that people who sit in jails and prisons are away from our sight. We cannot see them. Except, of course, for the people for whom they're sitting there is so painful every single day. The rest of this country has turned a blind eye. And so it is our religious imperative to wake people up, to create in them a sense of seeing and bring these stories into the light. And Isaiah says to us just a few chapters later, when we're in this incredibly pivotal moment, right? And Isaiah is saying, you know, God doesn't want you to do all of the desires of the temple, right? This ritual work, the things that seem on the surface like you're being a good person. Instead, God really wants us to let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke. And when Jews read this every year on Yom Kippur, as we sit in our own fasts, again and again, we are reminding ourselves that just sitting there on that day on Yom Kippur is not enough. But instead, we have to also be paying attention to those who are not free today and figure out ways to release them. Proverbs comes to remind us, do not rob the poor because he is poor. Do not crush the needy in the gate. And that line always bothers me because I wonder, on what planet is that something that we think we might do as humans, right? Like, in what way might a human being crush someone else because they are poor? But our tradition comes to teach us, yes, humans are possible of these terrible things. And in fact, it happens far too often. So much so that the text has to come to remind us not to crush the poor because they are poor. And yet we see this happening throughout the criminal justice system today as we punish people for their poverty in extreme bail and extreme sentencing, in the ways, the hundreds and thousands of collateral consequences that come even when someone is finally free. As surely as I live, Adonai declares, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, rather that they turn from their ways and live. Essentially, our God is a God that wants us to figure out ways to get back on the right path, right? And so this, to me, brings up all of the questions about what is the purpose of punishment? What is its ultimate gain? Is it really meant to help people redeem themselves, help folks figure out how to live lives that could be incredibly productive, that can be living up to their potential, right? Or is it, as we seem to be using it here in the United States of America, which just seems vicious and cruel and inhumane? We're reminded again in Exodus 34 of God's true nature when Moses, who has just come back up the mountain after breaking the tablets and being furious with the people, and God is furious with Moses and the people, and then they have this incredible restoration, this beautiful reunification. They fall in love again, Moses and God. And in this beautifully intimate moment, Moses says to God, I just want to know who you are. I want to see your face. And God says, I cannot show you my face or you will die. So I will hide you and protect you in this little cleft, but I will tell you my name. And this is my name. Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun. Adonai, Adonai, God, the compassionate and gracious one, slow to anger, abundant in kindness and truth, right? This is the God that we so desperately need to emulate here as we live on earth. And yet this, coming out of the mouths of people who claim to be folks of faith, right, seems so cruel and so ironic. And so we want to lift this piece of our tradition up and try to live it out through our actions every day, because ultimately We are all Tselem Elohim. We are made in the image of God. It is our job to try our best to emulate the divine where we can through our actions with one another. And finally, this last text, even though it comes from a dear colleague, Reverend Dr. Harold Dean Truclier at Howard University, and I abbreviated his comments here to just focus on the Jewish ones, but if you ever have a chance to hear him speak, you should. But he tells this story of one of his students at Howard University studying to be a minister who tried to play the shame game, talking about how she didn't like prisoners, how they were such horrible people. Well, if you don't like inmates, let me borrow your Bible, he said. When she asked why, I told her, we have to take some things out. If you don't like inmates, then we have to get rid of the book of Genesis because Joseph was an inmate. And if you don't like inmates, we have to eliminate the book of Jeremiah because he was in solitary confinement. If you don't like inmates, you have to tear out the book of Daniel because he was a two-time loser. Somebody tried to point out that those were all good people incarcerated for their faith. I countered by pointing out that Moses killed an Egyptian and David conspired to have his baby mama's husband murdered. And yet God used them all for positive purposes. This teaches us that the very narrative that we have around what it means to have been incarcerated must change. And that all of that alternative narrative we already have. We've just been highlighting the wrong stuff. And so now it's time to redeem our very faiths, our very traditions, our texts that we love so dearly that give us strength, and pull out from them, lift up this other kind of narrative that allows us to move forward and progress in ways that we understand to be what God really wants for us. And so what is it that our tradition, that religions say that we can do in this moment? We as faith community should be involved in ending mass incarceration because we have the political power to do something about it through our leaders, through our collective numbers, through our moral authority, because we're compelled through our covenants with one another and with God. And perhaps this is a calling, a moral imperative. I would argue yes. We are uniquely qualified because who else can speak to the public, can speak to one another about radical welcoming and forgiveness and second and third and 100 chances and compassion and Tselem Elohim and potential and hope and more. Our theology needs to be reorganized in order to lift up these messages. And finally, wherever people suffer, religious people are there. We must be there to witness and to love and to bring justice. Our perspective is longer. It goes back hundreds of years, thousands of years. And our relationships we have with one another are lifelong. And so we must organize and mobilize and bring consistent applied pressure to those who would imprison the people that we love. So I want to just tell you quickly about some of the ways in which we at the Temple and then in a partnership across lines of faith with the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church and many other faith communities here in Atlanta. Shout out to all of those from Atlanta here tonight. Saw some of those in the chat. The Temple is in the process of organizing our third Record Restriction Summit, in which our community comes together to provide free one-day record restriction for people who qualify for those. Until this past summer, the only people who qualified for the restriction of records so that they could get access to good jobs and scholarships and adoption and entry into the military and so much more were only people who had been arrested, not convicted. And so if you had been convicted of anything, you were saddled with that record for the rest of your life. We were also part of a coalition this past summer to expand record restriction laws so that today 1.9 million more people have access to record restriction because of the work of the Temple, Ebenezer, and so many others in our coalition. We are core partners, as Professor Malik said, in the Multi-Faith Initiative to End Mass Incarceration. We launched a conference also called Let My People Go in 2019 here in Atlanta. And our next conference is going to be Juneteenth 2022. Let this be a formal invitation to all of you to continue your learning and continue networking with one another. And there's so much more that we can be doing, as Dr. Cunningham Stringer said, more than prison ministries. That work is incredible. But the faith communities can be doing bailout days, re-entry support, family reunification, support specific to women and children, pipeline to possibility, wherein Faith communities are supporting DAs and judges who are coming up with alternative solutions to putting people in jail. If you want to know more about all of this work, you can check us out, www.endingmassincarceration.com. I'm so excited to be in conversation with my colleagues here in a few minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Medwin. And I really felt like your comments and your remarks followed so beautifully on the remarks that we heard from Dr. Ebony Cunningham Stringer, kind of growing kind of this expansive theological space or field that I think we're developing tonight and we're presenting tonight around this call to prison abolition and to end mass incarceration. I'm gonna now introduce our next interlocutor. Acharya Fleet Mall is a doctor, PhD, and the founder of a number of important and groundbreaking initiatives: the Prison Dharma Network, the Prison Mindfulness Institute, the Center for Mindfulness and Public Safety, the National Prison Hospice Association, and the Windhorse Seminars. He currently serves as the CEO and Director of Training, Research and Development for the Prison Mindfulness Institute, the Center for Mindfulness and Public Safety, and the Engaged Mindfulness Institute. Acharya, as I've learned, is the proper title for Dr. Mall as a senior Buddhist teacher and clergy member in two great Buddhist traditions, the Tibetan Shambhala tradition and the Zen Buddhist tradition. He has been engaged in these traditions for more than 45 years and brings an incredible life experience to our conversation tonight. Acharya Mall, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Malik. And thank you and greetings to all of you who've joined this really important conference and gathering that has been so incredibly rich so far. And although this conference, I think, and I hope serves as a call to action, I would like to invite us into just a moment of being and just invite us into even 20 seconds of just silence and perhaps dropping into the body, feeling our body, feeling our heart, feeling our connection to the earth, feeling our breath, our connection to spirit. In whatever way works best for us, connecting deeply with our own heart. May our dialogue here this evening be of tremendous benefit. Many years ago, I could have been introduced as prisoner 19864-044. I'm sometimes amazed that I still remember my prison number. I don't have it written down anywhere that I'm aware of, and I, for a long time, hoped it would disappear from my consciousness, but it has not yet disappeared. I want to give a little context. I'm liable to say a few provocative things tonight, so I want to give a little context for that. So I had a thorough Roman Catholic education, parochial education with Dominican nuns and Catholic priests, and then 4 years of very good Jesuit prep school education. I really figured out that the Buddhist path was my way, my spiritual path as a sophomore in high school, but I continued on and completed that Jesuit education. I graduated in 1968, one of the most tumultuous years in U.S. history, certainly comparable, but maybe even more tumultuous than what has been going on in the past year here in our country. It was the year of Martin Luther King's assassination and Bobby Kennedy's assassination and the killing of students at Kent State and many other incredibly impactful and divisive events. I grew up in the Midwest, and each summer of my years through high school, our city was ablaze with riots focused around race and oppression and the reactions to that. I fell headlong into the counterculture of the time. I was always a spiritual seeker. If I hadn't sort of found my way into the Buddhist path, I could have ended up going to a Catholic seminary, perhaps, to study for the priesthood. So I was always a seeker, and I fell headlong into the counterculture. And by the time I graduated from high school, I was incredibly politically alienated and culturally alienated. I'd really lost faith in my own culture. I really even started back with the first Kennedy assassination, and I never believed any of the explanations. And I just, I just really lost faith in what I've been taught to believe growing up in American culture. And I was angry, typical angry young man. And eventually to escape the craziness of the drug world that I was immersed in and all the rest of it, I left, became an expat traveling in South America, looking for something real, looking for something authentic. And that took me down some beautiful byways and some twisted byways. And before I could untangle it all, I earned my way into a federal prison sentence. And along the way, was thoroughly trained as a Buddhist practitioner and teacher. And I actually, by the time I was incarcerated, had a master's degree in Buddhist and Western psychology. I spent 20 years at a federal, I spent 14 years in a federal prison hospital, a maximum security federal prison hospital in the height of the AIDS epidemic. I taught school. My day job was teaching school for those 14 years, mostly helping African Americans and Latinos study for to get their GED, or in many cases learn to read, or to get their GED, or in some cases to study for college courses. That was my 9-to-5 day job. I spent almost all my free time up in the hospital caring for people who were dying. We started the first hospice program in a prison anywhere in the world in 1987. And then I launched an organization to spread that model out into the world. And then now around 75 or 80 prison hospice programs in the US in state and federal prisons. I also launched an organization called Prison Dharma Network from my cell to support prisoners and prison volunteers interested in meditation and Buddhism. And it eventually became broadly interfaith contemplative, including Christian centering prayer, Hatha yoga, Siddha yoga, Sufi programs, and so on. Since being released in 1999, I've been going into prisons all over the world and founded a Buddhist chaplaincy program at the Upaya Institute in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and taught it for 10 years, teaching socially engaged Buddhism and chaplaincy and formation for chaplains at Naropa University in Colorado. And more recently, I spent a lot of my time training police, correctional officers, probation, parole officers, U.S. Border Patrol, judges, prosecutors, and public defenders in mindfulness-based ways to do their jobs in ways that are less destructive to them and which will hopefully shift their mindset and create the possibility of actually trauma-informed corrections. And that's a big subject. I'm not going to go into that right now, but I wanted to give you that context for my remarks. So my colleagues have spoken very clearly about mass incarceration and its impact. For me, my awakening around our criminal justice system obviously had to do with ending up in prison myself with a mandatory minimum sentence for being involved in drugs and drug trafficking. And I was actually originally facing up to life in prison, a no parole sentence up to life in prison. And I was actually sentenced to 30 years. It was later reduced to 25. And fortunately, I was sentenced before 1987. So with all the good time, by staying out of trouble, I served 14 and a half years. Today, a federal prisoner receiving a sentence of 30 years would serve around 27 or 28, or 25 would serve around 22, 23 years with no reprieve other than a presidential pardon. It became clear to me very early on when I ended up in prison and really starting seeing the world I was in, that the prison industrial complex, which is a term I started using immediately because I was so already tuned into being an anti-war activist, the whole military industrial complex. And I don't know if I coined the phrase, but I remember using it myself quite a bit before I heard it from sociologists. But I was very aware of that, and I realized that mass incarceration in the prison industrial complex really was the de facto re-enslavement and disenfranchisement of Blacks in this country, and especially Black males. We all know there has been and continues to be an obscene level of racial disparity in our criminal justice system, with Blacks more likely to be arrested, more likely to be charged with more serious crimes, more likely to be convicted, more likely to receive and serve longer prison sentences, and more likely to be violated on parole. The good news is actually that disparity is lessening. There's some pretty significant change in the last 6 to 7 years. That's not something, it's kind of an inconvenient truth for activists who we always like to point to the worst case scenario, but I really think it's better and important for ourselves as human beings to actually appreciate that we're making progress and to have a good understanding of ourselves, to feel good about ourselves, and we are actually making progress. I think it's very important to keep that in mind. So mass incarceration is certainly driven, at least in part, by racism, and it's certainly highly racist in its impact. But I believe it actually has deeper causes, and that's what I want to talk about. Now, you might think I might be pointing to the drug war, and I'm not, even though that is a very significant cause. What I'd really like to address is the culture of blame, shame, the mindset of punishment, retribution, retaliation, and vengeance, and the theological roots of both. I'd also like this evening to call our attention to the psychological phenomena of othering and scapegoating, and our inability to understand and deal with the dynamics of shadow as a culture, and our collective psychological naivete in this country. Despite all the developments of psychology that are readily available, it has not been really embraced by our culture, and certainly not by our criminal justice system. So I'm a lover of all religious traditions and all spiritual traditions. I'm very much a Buddhist, but I'm also very much a universalist in many ways. So my intention here is not to blame, but just to really raise some issues that I think we really need to look at. So the well-known phrase, an eye for an eye, and the related law of retaliation, or lex talionis, rooted in various Babylonian and Abrahamic texts and codes, has taken various forms in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, some more rigid than others. There's a lot of theological and jurisprudence territory there for scholars to debate about, and that's beyond the scope of our present dialogue. But I would assert that the sum total impact of this theology has led to a cultural predilection towards blaming, shaming, retribution, punishment, and revenge. And this has all happened despite Jesus exhorting us to turn the other cheek, rejecting retaliation and revenge in Matthew 5:39, and the actual gospel of love, which for me is the heart of Christianity. In particular, the theology of the flawed or fallen nature of humanity, taught by early Christian theologians like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, and particularly emphasized to different degrees in various Protestant denominations like Calvinism and some forms of Lutheran and Methodist theology, and especially in the less reformed versions of these denominations. So this doctrine, again, operates across the spectrum from the extreme theology of our total depravity since the fall to more reformed and moderate versions of our fallen nature, balanced somewhat against the theology of Imago Dei, or the image of God, that we're created in the image of God. There is nonetheless an almost universal adaptation of this doctrine of original sin, as opposed to any theology or the theology which is actually deemed heretical of original righteousness, or what Matthew Fox, the excommunicated Catholic priest, who's now an Episcopal priest, called original blessing. There are essentially three views of human nature across our shared religious and philosophical history as human beings, really across the globe and throughout history. The first is that of the inherently pure nature of humanity. The second is the blank slate philosophy or idea. And the third is this idea of inherently flawed nature. And actually, the first one, that human beings have an inherently pure nature, has actually been the dominant philosophy cross-culturally across history until modern times in the West, where this flawed nature has really impacted our cultural view of ourselves as human beings. So what this has resulted in is a dominant belief, and it's particularly here in the US, that absent some coercive threat of punishment, shaming, and shame is really the emotion we feel when love is withdrawn or we're rejected, the being kicked out, the ostracization. Absent the threat of that, the coercive threat of that human beings are dangerous. We will not behave well. And thus, all of our institutions are essentially fear-based and based on that in this country and largely in the West as well. This contrasts with the Buddhist view and theology, if you will, of what in my own particular tradition, my first teacher called basic goodness and what is more broadly known as Buddha nature, which could be an equivalent of, if you use a term like Christ nature or Krishna nature or divine nature. But it is the idea that there is nothing fundamentally wrong with our nature. There is nothing fundamentally wrong with life, that life is inherently good, that our nature is inherently good and unstained. And yes, we have a lot of challenges. And however, in my own tradition and across all Buddhist traditions, we see the problem of what is often termed as ego or self-centeredness, or if you will, sin, as something that is more of a surface phenomena that is completely transcendable, both through one's own effort and through grace, depending on the Buddhist tradition, and a mixture of both. We have a very complex and subtle understanding within the Buddhist tradition of causes and conditions, not only within this lifetime, but across lifetimes. And something called codependent origination, of how causes and conditions come together to create the circumstances that we face in life and that we perpetuate in life. And we see this as the mechanism of a mistaken view about reality and the resulting emotional turmoil and confusion that comes up out of that. So Buddhism is an essentially non-dual tradition, that it sees the subject-object split as an illusion. And all of the mystical elements of the great religious traditions point to this same non-duality, but it has even been accused as heresy in many of those same religious traditions. But in Buddhism, it's right out front. It's right out front. And so it's really the human condition. We're all born in a very fragile state, and we need to survive somehow. We need to seek an identity. Within 6 months or so, we have to begin separating from the mother and forming a separate identity from which to navigate life. And we form that identity out of whatever's around. And we all get some mixture of love and shaming and caring and neglect. And most of us had a mixed bag of that. So we form our identities of what are there. This is a human condition, that we find ourselves in adulthood with a strong sense of duality, a belief in the solidity of me and the solidity of other. And then the Buddhist path is about deconstructing that duality and realizing that it is an illusion, and that underneath that illusion is what we call Buddha nature or basic goodness. So it's not a matter of having to change our nature or needing some external salvific force, although in Pure Land Buddhism, there is that notion of grace, but it's rather just uncovering what is already there. And this is not just in some long-term, quest for total enlightenment, but that underlying basic goodness is available to us all the time. And in fact, we experience it all the time in life. What are the vast majority of human beings? All of us do every morning. We get up, we do our best to take care of ourselves, take care of our children. We queue up at the well, we queue up at the store, we drive on the right side of the road. We are phenomenally cooperative and collaborative until fear sets in. When fear sets in, of course, and we're scared we can't get our needs met, then we see all kinds of behaviors, even the worst of human behaviors. So I would say that our real quest is to lower the fear level so that our natural instincts towards altruistic behavior can shine through. And we know from current neuroscience that actually we are not only hardwired for survival and a fear and survival based way of living, but we are also hardwired for altruism, self-transcendence, and compassion. It's just a matter of realizing the possibility of that. So I also would assert, and I think the last thing I'll point to is that our society is psychologically naive and that we don't really understand the dynamics of shadow and othering and scapegoating. You know, I would say underlying racism is the human problem of othering. You know, apparently we like to be around people that feel like us, look like us, and we're afraid of people that look or feel less like us. So we're clannish and tribal, and we tend to other, and we tend to project all of the disowned negativities and parts of ourselves that we don't accept onto others. And the whole phenomenon of the shadow. And I would say the prison industrial complex is the most egregious aspect of the social shadow in our culture. So organizations like Prison Dharma Network and other contemplative organizations doing prison work offer alternatives that are grounded in the view of the basic goodness of humanity, our own basic goodness and everyone else's basic goodness. And so there are many programs that are based in mindfulness, emotional intelligence, and that call prisoners to take ownership for their own life and develop their own best qualities. And so envisioning that, I just want to call out Bo Lazoff and Sita Lazoff, who have envisioned the possibility that prisons could be centers of kindness, and Robin Kosarjian, who's envisioned them as houses of healing, and our Path of Freedom that envisions them as places where prisoners can find their way into the path of freedom. I'm essentially a prison abolitionist, but I realize we do need to deal with the problematic human behaviors, so I may not be able to go 100% in that direction, but I believe we can use our criminal justice system to heal and transform lives rather than to destroy lives as it currently does. Thank you very much.
Acharya Mal, thank you so much. You said it would be provocative, but actually I felt it was something even deeper than that. I think it addressed some of like the really profound, fundamental theological, spiritual questions that are at the very heart of what each of our guests have presented so far, and I think you've named them in such a granular way, and I can't wait to pick up. I think some of the important challenges that you've put in front of us. I'm going to move into discussion and conversation by saying that sadly, Dr. Jimmy Jones has had to leave us for tonight and will not be able to participate in our panel. Dr. Jones is someone who is incredibly beloved to me, a teacher, a professor, a scholar, an activist, a founder of institutions, and a longtime New Havenite and a pillar of the community here, and particularly of the Muslim community here. During the first part of this session, he received the heartbreaking news that his sister had passed away from COVID-19, and he had to immediately make his way to his family. I hope that everyone who's on this call, and particularly the blessed panelists that we have before us, that I hope we can just take a moment right now and say a prayer for Dr. Jones's sister, and to also say a prayer for of recognition and of blessing and of grace on all those who have passed during this extraordinary and unsettling year that we have been through. I think we're only beginning to recognize, in the same way as we're only beginning to really fathom the human costs and the long-term human costs of the prison industrial complex. In so many ways, the tragedy of COVID and the pandemic has been, so much of it has been created by unequal and frankly oppressive systems, and we know that people of color in particular have faced the sharp end of what this pandemic has wrought. So I wonder if we could just take a moment in our own way, in our own traditions, to say a prayer, not only of support to Dr. Jones and his family, to his sister, may she have compassion and grace and light on her journey home, but to all those who have passed away during this past year. Let's take a moment. Thank you very much, friends. There's so much to pick up. So I want to bring all of our panelists onto the screen so I can see all of you. I'm gonna some of you I'm just gonna add your spotlights to our proceedings, and there is. Well, let me first ask the three of you if there's anything that you'd like to say in response to or engaging with what some of our colleagues have said around the table. Let me offer you that first, because I have a list of questions which I'm sure would take us hours, and I'm eager to get into it. But I'm going to turn the floor over to you, Dr. Cunningham Stringer, and just ask you, as you listen to Rabbi Medwin and what Acharya Mal kind of brought to us, how did that resonate with you? Were there certain things that you heard which sparked new questions, or by which you felt challenged?
Yeah, I've been sitting here taking notes, and it has been a learning experience for me. I feel well fed this evening. But I will just raise 2 points, one from each of my colleagues. I was intrigued, Lydia, with this idea of God doesn't want us just doing ritual work, and what it means to move beyond going through the motions. What new rituals do we need to incorporate into our practice that have been left at the wayside?
Such a great question. Is the vision to go ahead and respond? Should we get into the conversation?
Yeah, if we could, Rabbi, if I could hold us back just 1 minute, and Dr. Cunningham Stringer, what was the second point that you wanted to make? Because I want to get that down, and then we'll move to Rabbi Medwin.
Yeah. Okay. So what really intrigued me about Fleet's comments was this idea of shaming and rejection. I thought that was going to be the big catcher, but then at the last moment, he caught me with that fear, reducing fear levels, and what that means for the work that we do as faith-filled people. So those are my two things that I'm grappling with.
Absolutely. That last comment on fear also really struck me. I was reading it was a presentation earlier this week, and I love this quote from the Persian Sufi mystic and Islamic scholar Hafiz, who says to his friends, who refers to his friend living in fear as wanting for him to live in better conditions. That the room of fear, which so many of us occupy, are conditions that are not conducive to any sense of humanity and will always reduce our humanity. And is those living conditions that we need to change, which really resonated with me as I was listening to Acharya Mal. Rabbi Medwin, feel free to respond to Dr. Cunningham Stringer, but also I'd love to hear what was buzzing and popping for you as you were listening to this presentation.
Absolutely. I mean, so in response, there is that line from Isaiah comes back to us, as I said, on Yom Kippur every day, the day where we are, physically at our most vulnerable moment, and probably in our heads thinking like, look how awesome I am for fasting all day. Of course, our brothers and sisters from the Islamic faith to take it to another level, which I so, admire. But for the spiritual learning that must come from that. But this notion of what it would mean to create a ritual that actually had the impact of action, of what God actually intended for us to do. Some friends and I were bouncing this around, like, what would it look like to create church and synagogue and mosque ritual and temple ritual that welcomed people back from prisons? What would that mean for, at the temple, the sisterhood, the women to provide supplies and make sure folks were landing in a safe and comfy and loving place, right? Instead of this hard world that has already passed judgment on them. And what would it look like for communities of faith, for the cultures inside of there to be so radically welcoming? That a friend of mine, the same woman who was telling me about what was happening in Columbus, Georgia, she went to 4 churches before she found one that would finally love and accept her, right? And so what would it look like for us to create some standards that would never happen, that the first church would know exactly how, or synagogue, right? Any of our communities would know how to just embrace and love and care for people returning from that terrible experience. For me, I'm unfamiliar with the term. I think it's Acharya. I'm saying that right, Acharya?
Acharya.
Okay, Acharya, I love that. Acharya Mal. Also, this question of fear and shame stood out to me. And I wonder what the imagination looks like on how that happens on a societal level. Like, what does that look like? And I love the vision of a transformed prison system that actually heals and can care for people. In Atlanta, we've been petitioning the city hall to transform the jail into a place of care. And they talk about wraparound services of all different kinds, but I wonder what that looks like in terms of the way we police and the way that we administer justice and the way all the parts of the system. And then if I could also shoot a question back to Dr. Cunningham Stringer, another vision that we keep playing with our Ending Mass Incarceration question, initiative or movement is, what does it look like to move out of the negative and into the positive? In other words, instead of always talking about ending mass incarceration, like, what are we beginning instead? And it made one of our partners here locally, the CEO of the National Incarceration Association, who herself has a son who was incarcerated, it made her wonder, what would it look like if women ran prisons? What if mamas ran prison? And those kinds of questions just inspire me and spark me and make me want to, that's what's exciting for me in this conversation.
Thank you, Rev. Edwin. That whole question of ritual and the important role, of course, that our faith institutions play in creating ritual, which then sort of weaves certain realities right into our liturgical life, and it was so interesting as you mentioned this incredible vision of kind of how which we welcome people back into community, right, and to that embrace. It almost reminded me of it did remind me of the tradition in many Muslim communities, not only in the United States but around the world, of welcoming people back when they come home from the Hajj pilgrimage, and it's a very kind of, it's an embracing moment, but it's also a ritualized moment. And there's a giving of gifts and acceptance back, because of course in even a generation or two before, going for the Hajj would have been a life-threatening activity. One may not have returned, and so that return was so important. It seems in a way what a profound way to look at this notion of integrating back into community, where the entire community takes part through the formation of ritual. Acharya Mal, I already, shame, your discussion of shame and rejection has been lifted. Your discussion about how do you move spaces of oppression and violence into spaces of healing has already been lifted, and this question of fear has been lifted. Did you hear things from Dr. Cunningham Stringer and Rabbi Medwin that resonated with you and that you'd like to specifically respond to? And then we can pick up some of these threads.
Yeah, certainly. So, Ebony, I remember you were talking about the prison ministry and the Black churches, and the prison ministry is very large within white churches as well. And where I did my time, I was very involved in a chapel because I led a Buddhist meditation group there for 14 years. Our prison hospice program was grounded there. We had our clinical team meetings there, and it was very much a shared space. In fact, when our Buddhist group met, they split the chapel in half. It would be opened up for big, services, but they split it in half. And we either had a Christian group on the other side or we had a Black Muslim group on the other side. And we'd be sitting there meditating in silence while they'd be preaching on the other side. Always those towns. So I lived and breathed in an interfaith world, and I've been involved in interfaith work ever since. But, there was a quality, and this was brought up by a lot of prisoners, of some of the volunteers who came. Well, I'll just say we had only a few Buddhist volunteers come in where I was, because it was Southwest Missouri, one of the buckles of the Bible Belt, not a big area for Buddhism. And but we did have a couple local that came in. And to me, that felt similar to the AANA 12-step volunteers that came in, which was a huge part of my life and transformation there, because they really just met us as we were as human beings. I mean, it was like, you're a drunk, I'm a drunk, and with the Buddhist volunteers, we're going to sit down and meditate together. We're going to study together. Maybe not universally so, but many of the other religious volunteers came in with this kind of idea of fixing and saving people. And they would do a great job. And, I think a lot of lives have been saved in prisons, even with what I consider fairly fundamentalist and fear-based approaches. But I think a lot of lives have been saved, and very necessary, and whatever works to get people off the track that they're on. But nonetheless, people unplug the keyboard and go out, right? And many of the prisoners who would then try to relate with those congregations and find a place in those congregations upon release were shunned and not welcomed. Now, I want to say that Buddhist Sanghas are not immune to this. We've had issues mostly with sex offenders being released from prison and being part of our in-prison programs, and then coming out and, some Buddhist Sanghas communities wanting to welcome them, but dealing with a lot of fear among their members. And sometimes the leadership wants to accommodate and welcome them, but then they get people in the congregation or the Sangha full of fear around their children. Sex offenses brings up so much fear for all of us. So we're not at all immune to this, but that struck me in that issue of the transition between prison and the community, and how we can do a much better job than that. And I really, Lydia, I love what you were saying. I think you were relating to a number of places in the scriptures of the Talmud or the Old Testament of all the examples of people who were themselves incarcerated. And so if you're not willing to be with inmates, you got to take that out and take that out. And that really resonated with me because of this, do we really believe in redemption? And in our Buddhist tradition, we have Milarepa, the great yogi saint of Tibet, before he converted and became this recognized through a long path of suffering and hard practice as an enlightened being. He had a long history previously of crime and even killing. Or even more famous is Angulimala, who was basically a serial killer, who was transformed in an encounter with the Buddha and then became considered a bodhisattva and an enlightened being. So there's this very much this belief in redemption. And I would just come back to the final point was, despite all of our, the inherent contemplative and love aspects and redemptive aspects of all our religious traditions, I feel that our U.S. society doesn't really believe in redemption.
I want to pick that last point up because I think it also strikes at the very heart of what we've been talking about tonight. In a way, I think we could suggest that the prison industrial complex as we see it now is really the final stage of the kind of systems of colonization, oppression, and so on that we have been witnessing for hundreds, thousands of years, but certainly the 400 years since chattel slavery and the genocide of indigenous people. In the same way as Lenin would have said that imperialism is the highest form of capitalism, the prison industrial complex is the natural endpoint of a system which is bound deeply in oppression and which may give lip service to the idea of redemption, has belief systems that promote redemption, but don't operationalize that. And I wonder, and I think all of you have addressed it, but I'll come to you, Dr. Ebony, first. Are we in a moment right now where, and of course you're from this incredible Black church tradition, which has always, when I as a Muslim return to your tradition to find to understand the ways in which Black theologians have contended with the contemporary and have questioned God and have sought to find a space for belief and action and change. But I guess my question is that are we at a moment right now where we are open in a way that we haven't been before to ask the difficult questions that Acharya Mal has been asking us to ask about certain fundamental ideas in our own faith traditions? And while we while we appeal to tradition and we honor our traditions, do you think we're at a moment now where we're having to kind of deeply question them in light of this kind of moment that we're in? Dr. Ebony, and then I'll turn over to Rabbi Medwin.
I would say that there are some spaces that have opened up to be more progressive than what they have been in the past, but I still know of some very closed spaces where this kind of thinking is just abominable, right? But what we do is work within the spaces that we have. And I see great things happening. I see, I have attended now summits on Capitol Hill, hearings on Capitol Hill that have been led by clergy, appealing to our lawmakers with regard to justice reform. And, especially out of some of our more conservative traditions like Pentecostalism, I'm seeing this arise out of Pentecostal spaces, which traditionally you would not see something like this. And so I think that there is a breaking of day. I think there are some spaces opening up. And I think that as we continue to crack those spaces wide open, more people will see the light, and hopefully we'll bring them along with us.
Just as a quick follow-up, Dr. Ebony, do you see some of the resistance that you've talked about to prison abolition and to challenging the prison industrial complex and a robust theology of liberation? Do you still see a resistance to that within Black churches? And what does that conversation look like within African American religious communities?
I will say this: the Black church is an American institution, which means that it is saddled with a lot of the isms, sexism, right? Classism, racism. And so these are all chains that need to be broken. And I think we're working through those things. I'm trying to, the other part of your question, what was the other part?
What are some of the conversations that are happening within the Black church that as you're recognizing that there's a spectrum, as a broad spectrum, are there spaces with this kind of where churches are challenging churches, and is there a model for that to happen? Because I'm just reflecting back on the Muslim experience. I know that in our mosques that are where the religious leadership and the community leadership is are of immigrant background or have come from the Arab world or South Asia or elsewhere, that often there's a lip service around issues like racism, acknowledgement that anti-Black racism is real, that systemic oppression is real, that there's a need for racial justice. But when the issue of the carceral state comes up, and exactly what others have said around how do our communities accept and create space, but also how do our communities interface with other Muslims who are not, who are African American or from other traditions, then I think there's a real challenge, and we fall short. So in a way, in some ways it's me bringing kind of a selfish question into it: is that are there emerging mechanics, spaces where this kind of robust dialogue is happening, and could that maybe be a model of how that could happen in other faith communities?
So others may not agree with me, but I am of the feeling that lip service is, I think, very much where we are, especially as we talk about communicating across different racialized congregations. But I believe that that is the first step to progress, right? And I believe as we begin to speak things out, we actually are framing our futures. Right? So we are breathing life into the possibilities and the dreams that we're dreaming as we articulate them, even if we haven't put feet to our prayers just yet. Mm. And so I can value that process for what it is and where the possibilities of where it can lead to.
No, I appreciate that. Rabbi Medwin, you described this kind of process that you've been involved in terms of movement building. And I'm really interested to hear, once again, take us into the nitty gritty a little bit. Take us into the mechanics of what those conversations across faith traditions are like. What are some of the challenges that you are meeting? And how are you overcoming them? And then, of course, feel free to respond to a whole host of other things that are on the table. But I would love, because you're there, you're sort of you're at the heart of this creative process that is happening between faith communities. And I think it's really important. I mean, we speak about it often. I mean, I think we all know, right? This kind of interfaith dilemma, right? Interfaith is happening. Oh, good. Very good. It's happening. It's excellent. But few people outside understand what is happening. And here, this is not merely like, let's have an interfaith for peace or something. We are talking about ending mass incarceration, engaging with a major societal institution. I'd love to hear about how that process is going.
Great. I want to comment on that second. So you may have to remind me of some of those.
No problem at all. You take it your own way.
Notes. I'm going to come back to it, but I want to make some comments on what Dr. Cunningham Stringer was saying, because I think so often, like, many Christian Americans, Jewish Americans believe that Judaism and democracy are like hand in hand. They're side by side. They're like essentially the same thing, And so, we feel really comfortable in terms of the values. Often they do align in a lot of important ways, but there are important ways where they do not align. And I think one of those ways is about how we orient ourselves with regards to self versus community. To overgeneralize, but I think it's been said many times, right? Americans are hyper individualistic, right? And everything is about the self. And we have produced some incredible self, telling applications and frameworks, right? The selfie, all of the various social media platforms are just all about like narrating your own self. And I don't think all of that is bad, right? We have this sense of personal freedom that we can really develop our own individual identities. But I think we have lost a little bit this other emphasis that the great traditions of the world really bring, which is about what does that mean? What does it mean when your community needs you? And that might actually impinge on some of your own personal freedom or your own selfhood, and so, what does it look like in a religious context? From a Jewish perspective, I like to ask my congregants, like, what does it mean to emphasize the we of relationship, right? The one-to-one conversation wherein you discover that somebody is different and also similar to you, and you begin to love that person despite or because of their differences. Like, how do we break out of our own little personal echo chambers? And then the second level of that is the we of communities. And that's where some of this interfaith work starts, right? What does it mean to be so in relationship with some of from different communities that instead of feeling like we have to understand the ins and outs of whatever issues are affecting them, we just believe them when they say we are hurting, like stop analyzing the questions and just go help, right? And be willing to put in your own lot together, because that is the ultimate truth, right? And that's what our traditions tell us all the time. Like, we are all on this little blue planet together. And that's the third level of we, right? Which is this sort of growing global consciousness. And that my choices about what I buy and what I believe affect the rest of the world. And so, how do we expand our consciousness of we, even in the face of feeling pretty countercultural, which is ironic because we live in one of the most religious societies in the world on lots of different levels. And yet that element has really been sort of overrun by our Americanness, and I would argue in some ways. But this is a really big Jewish question right now, internal to our tradition. Some recent surveys have shown us that at least 1 in 5 Jews, 20% of the Jewish community, identifies as a person of color. And so this isn't like a us-them conversation. This is a us-us conversation, and really also having to break down all of the American isms that come, as Dr. Cunningham Stringer said, with what it means to be American inside of the Jewish community. And so, our definition of we has to be altered even more so. So I wanted to just comment on that. Some of the mechanics, the challenges of interfaith work and conversation and movement building. And I'll add to I'll layer onto that also, intercultural, interracial, intergenerational, right? I mean, and that's a big deal. Our young folks are like, let's do this now. And the older generations are like, we got to wait, we have a process, things take time. And so there's a lot of conversation. There is, in this movement specifically, the Multi-Faith Initiative to End Mass Incarceration, my partner is Reverend John Vaughn, is the executive pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church. And I lean a lot on him and his wisdom as just being this really cool, level-headed human who is able to take different people's vision and take pieces of it. I like to describe it as having a blurry vision. So I have my blurry vision, you've got your blurry vision. How do we bring them together so that they actually harmonize in different ways? Just continuing to show up has been an element of all of this, right? Like, doing 1 or 2 programs a year is not going to get you very far down the road in your relationship building and your movement building and making any kind of change. And so continuing to show up, even if you don't feel like you know the answers, I think is a part of it. Being that good listener and combining a visioner, and then dropping this, what I see, or what I've learned recently about the white culture and the need to always sort of bring perfection to your work, right? We just try stuff, and sometimes it works and it goes somewhere, and sometimes it flops. Okay, great, we learn from it and we move on. And so I think there's that element as well of just of staying focused and trying things and failing when we need to, hopefully quickly, and moving on. So that's been our journey. We are in, I haven't described it yet. We're in 6 different states.
Wow.
In New York, Georgia, Texas, Arkansas, Wisconsin, and California. We have some different hubs in those different places, and we're really working with people on the ground to add benefit, to come alongside whatever amazing work is already happening there. Just trying to network the networks, and it has been an incredible blessing to my life. So.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rabbi Medwin. And there's a really interesting comment directed towards you, Acharya Mal. One of our guests says, I think what I hear you saying is our understanding of God is retributive. Our concept of hell for those who disobey, in inverted commas, most certainly informs our current ability to excuse mass incarceration. Saint Anselm's theory of atonement. I hope this is what I hear, because I think you are right. The benefit of interfaith is that we can look at ourselves through the lens of Buddhism. But I would take that a step further in line with what you were saying, Rabbi Medwin. Through this work of interreligious movement building, we start to see our own faiths and inform our own faith through the prism of those who are of faithfulness around us. I'd love for your comment on that, Acharya Mal, and feel free to pick up on any of the other comments that have been made. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Just contextually, you know, I ended up being drawn to two Buddhist traditions that have a very strong social conscious and social transformation focus. The Shambhala tradition, started by a Tibetan master whose vision for creating a more enlightened society. And my Zen tradition is actually called the Zen Peacemakers. And my Zen teacher, Bernie Glassman, a longtime social activist who always focused on interfaith work, and in fact, trained and empowered two Catholic nuns, a Catholic priest, a rabbi, and an imam as Zen masters and teachers. So all involved in that work. And we've been putting on what we call bearing witness retreats, interfaith bearing witness retreat at Auschwitz for over 20 years. More recently, I founded the first one in Rwanda. We've been working with Native Americans bearing witness retreats in the Black Hills for the last 6 years. And to this weekend, we're doing our first bearing witness retreat around race. And it's a parallel event. So I wasn't able to be at the afternoon's event because in partnership with an organization called Solution Remembers and the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Solution Remembers is in Florida. We've been doing this weekend bearing witness event around the impact of everything we're talking about right now. So I say that just contextually because I think for me, it's even though race is certainly intermingled and all of its colonialization and all of these things we often talk about are wrapped up in mass incarceration, but I just feel it goes deeper than that. I feel it's really in the human condition. And I think we need to understand the impact of the human condition where, you know, for any species, job one is survival. So our biology is set up, it's survival focused. And we can transcend that. We're conscious beings. We have the gift of being able to, but we are really driven by that survival focus. And it's impacted all the great religions, even Buddhism, which is completely nonviolent. And I don't think you can find any examples in Buddhist scriptures of any affirmation of violence. And yet we have fundamentalist Buddhists in Sri Lanka perpetuating violence against the Tamil. We have the problem in Burma where we have fundamentalist Buddhists involved in suppression and even possibly through their military genocide of the Rohingya people. So Buddhists have not been free of this because I think the human condition, this fear-based biology, can corrupt anything. And I really think it's at the real root of our approach to criminal justice and jurisprudence in this country. And so the reason I say that is because I think where we need to go is find the best integration from our great religious traditions, our best understanding of human psychology and our current understanding of neuroscience and neurobiology. And Buddhism is, in the US anyway, has been at the forefront of this. There's now this mainstream mindfulness movement, which is a secular movement, but the practices come out of Buddhist meditation, but are informed by neuroscience. And I really think we have a criminal justice system that's based on pseudoscience, outdated ideas, old religious ideas. And it really, we know how to help people. We actually now know the neuronal constituents of well-being, and human beings who experience well-being do not misbehave. We see pro-social behaviors as directly connected to perceived and felt well-being, and antisocial behavior is connected with the other. So we know how to help human beings train themselves to experience well-being and less fear, and then you're going to see transformed behaviors. And we also can really understand, I've been a student of religion for a long time, we now understand a lot about the neuroscience of different religious modalities like meditation, contemplation, like faith, like liturgical practices, like singing, like being in fellowship, like swaying together. We understand the impact of trauma, the healing effects on trauma, all this. So I think we really looked at understanding the best of psychology, the best of neuroscience, and identifying all these religious modalities that all the great religious traditions share. We can understand how to actually help people and transform people and get out of our doctrinal disputes and really understand, because we all have the same human brain and human body, despite whatever theology or religious practice we identify with, we have exactly the same brains and neurobiology. And so the impact of whether it's meditation or contemplation or liturgy or faith, these are human practices that we've been doing for thousands of years to transform ourselves. And if we had that focus, we could get out of the dark ages of criminology and I think into a new age.
What you're saying reminds me of something my late mentor used to talk about. He used to talk about convergence, not conversion. He said this is a time of the necessity of convergence. So I saw you nodding your head, Dr. Ebony, and I am keeping an eye on the time. We have about 10 minutes to go. But I want to come to this point. I mean, it's sort of like what Charlie Amal calls the larger social project, what Rabbi Medwin calls this kind of the movement to kind of dismantle and to harness the collective spiritual resources and the spiritual communities in order to come to reform. Are our movements addressing? We are addressing the prison industrial complex. We're addressing mass incarceration. Are we also addressing those kind of underlying human condition of being in fear? And if so, what kind of, I guess, modalities, practices do you feel need to come to the fore? I think we've been provided with, Charlie Amal's given us a sense of what some of those practices are, but from your tradition and from where you sit, how can we bring those transformative practices into society? One of our questions, as I'm just being reminded by Mapilo, is someone asking about how do we get this message to people in middle school and people and start early, so that we don't grow into systems of fear. Go ahead, Dr. Ebony.
And I want to make sure I'm pronouncing the title correctly. Achara. Am I saying it correctly? All right.
You can just call me Fleet. That's fine.
Is that okay? I want to honor, who you are. As you were speaking, a biblical text came to mind, which talks about how perfect love casts out fear, right? And so a simple answer to your question of how do we get there is radical love. Absolutely. Radical love. The scripture also talks about loving your neighbor as you love yourself. And when you do that, the same mercy and grace that we afford ourselves for every time we messed up, for every time we prayed that prayer, God, if you get me out of this one, right? Which all of us have probably prayed from one time to another. That same grace that you experience, it is an act of radical love to afford that to others. And I love what you're saying about mindfulness. I am grateful. I'm fortunate enough that my children, they're starting to teach that in daycare now. Mm-hmm. Mindfulness. They're 5 and 7, and they have a level of self-reflectivity that I just didn't have probably until yesterday, right? Because they're being taught that from a very young age. And I think that is going to get us on the path that we need to be on. I think future generations are going to walk on that path a little more easier than the corralling that we're trying to do for older folks. Now, Lydia, you talked about earlier, if we're ending mass incarceration, then what are we beginning? And I want to suggest a restorative justice, and we have models for this. And interestingly, we have evidence that these models work. Right? So if you want to know about righteousness and justice, right? What is going to make things right? You ask the victim. I would venture to believe that most victims do not feel any better because someone is incarcerated for the crime that they committed, right? If I own a grocery store and you stole out of my store, I don't want you to go to jail. I want you to show up at my store for the next 8 Saturdays and help me stock the shelves and help me. And maybe I can even teach you a little bit about business in the process, right? So that whatever the conditions are that led to you pilfering in the first place, we might be able to even deal with that. So restorative justice is what I would like to see us move towards. And we've done this experiment in young people, and we have seen it work for them. That experiment is going on in Philadelphia right now, right down the road from where I live. And first of all, not only are we making amends with victims and community, but we get to see what's at the root of why these children are acting in these ways in the first place. And it turns on that a kid is just a whole lot less cranky at school if he has food in the house and electricity on in the house, right? All of a sudden now he's not back talking to the teacher or trying to assault the teacher, because as Fleet has alluded to, the fear is diminished. I don't have to worry about where my next meal is coming from. My basic needs are met. And these are the tributaries that I spoke about to the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration, poverty, undersourced education, et cetera, et cetera.
We have about 5 minutes to go. So, Rabbi Medwin, I want to give you a chance to jump in, I think, on this discussion around restorative justice and spiritual practices and the ways in which we can bring those into our communities. It not only in dealing with mass incarceration, but actually building up our collective spiritual resources and understanding for the possibilities of a society that mitigates fear, shame, and rejection. But also, perhaps you can help us move to this last part of our conversation by maybe also sharing with us about, at this particular moment as a religious leader, what is your call to us? If we were going to walk away from this conversation and I wanted to hold on to something that you said, what would that call to action be from you? So we'll start with you, Rabbi, on all these points, and then hear from Acharya Mal, and then finish off with you, Dr. Emily, before they bring that cane and they take us all off the stage. Go ahead, Rabbi.
So tomorrow morning, actually, 9:30 in the morning, I'm going to be teaching a bunch of teens about racial justice and what Judaism has to say about it. And, I think, again, starting with our youth, using the sort of bully pulpit we have as religious leaders to teach, to connect with our children about this stuff. And a lot of my leaders, actually, lay leaders, are being urged on because their children are pressing them on these big questions. And so, the kids are really teaching the adults. But I think what that really comes down to is how relationships are transformative, and the ways in which, sort of in this Buberian sense, that when we encounter the other and really connect with them and commune with them in a certain way, that there's a third party there, that the divine enters into that conversation as well. I think part of our mission, in Reform Judaism specifically, we have really rooted ourselves in this prophetic tradition to call out, into the halls of power, the voices of those prophets. And I think the big part of what we need to do going forward is to connect that with people's understanding of their own contemplative practice, to go back to sort of a theme for our conversation. Like, how does that work out in the world connect to how I see myself and what my role is in this world, and how I am rooted and nourished by the divine as I enter into public spaces. And so to connect those two worlds more concretely feels like a really big part of our work. And if I were going to leave everybody with, I guess, a final word, I would say I've been very inspired by some of my rabbinic teachers who talk about a river. And the river is moving towards justice and towards equity and towards love. even when it looks frozen over on the top, even when it seems logjam, nothing's going anywhere. There's this river that has a constant force to it. And I think that for me, as I encounter the world and learn more and more about people's specific stories of pain and hurt, I have to hope that my little drop, my little contribution to that river is making a difference. It's going somewhere. And I think that that's true for all of us. We are all in our inactivity complicit in supporting the system. And we are all in our tiny little things that we can do in our faith communities in this context, making a difference, doing what we can. And I want to give everybody that hope and that like high five over the internet. Great job. It's making a difference.
Thank you, Robert Lidman. Acharya Mal, what do we take? What do we take from this conversation? What do you want us to hold on to?
Well, I really love what Rabbi Lydia just said. And I was also very struck by Dr. Ebony surfacing restorative justice, because this is such a critical part of the answer going forward. And I would ask people to explore what's called transformative justice, which goes even deeper, in my view, than restorative justice. It's more preventative and really looks into the causes and conditions within an individual and within society out of which problematic behaviors arise in the first place. That term more often used in New Zealand, Australia. And, there's many stories and traditions within Aboriginal communities and indigenous communities, a tribal community in Africa, or when there's problematic behavior, they bring the person in the center of the circle and they all talk about how wonderful they are until the person is just embarrassed into transformation, right? I mean, there's all these wonderful stories. Of course, now how do you do that at scale? Now, there's the Norway model now that many people have heard about, where they're taking a much more enlightened view. Now, that's a smaller scale and a much more homogenous. The U.S. is tough, right? It's a very diverse country and it's at a huge scale, so it's tough. But restorative justice and transformative justice offer really wonderful possibilities. And I would say connect the philosophies and some of the tried and true best practices of transformative justice and restorative justice with a better psychological and neurobiological and universalist understanding of all the great religious and spiritual technologies from around the whole world, because we know how to help people transform their lives. We know how. And I don't mean by limiting it to the psychological and neurobiological understanding to limit that it also involves grace and transcendence, because it does. But there's still a lot we can understand, and it coming together, because we can understand that all across the world, religiously and spiritually inclined people have been doing the same things and finding the same ways into transformation. They've also been finding the same way into fear-based fundamentalist religion too, right? So, I mean, it can go either way, but we can find our way into that gospel of love and into doing the things that we know help transform human beings if we're really willing to study what we do and let it be informed not only by grace, but also by the best of psychology and neurobiology.
Acharya Mal, thank you. Dr. Ebony, you started us off this evening really with this incredible testimony from Krista and Nicole, and you grounded it in experience. You grounded it in these heartbreaking personal narratives, and you focused for us on the human. Thinking about all of the incredible perspectives that we've heard tonight, incredibly thought-provoking perspectives that we heard tonight. What would you like to send us all away with? What's your call to action to us this evening?
My call to action is, let us reclaim justice, what it really means. Not to buy in with to the colonized iterations of it, but what does justice, let us ask our God what justice is, and let us pursue it with all our hearts, with all our minds, and with all our souls.
Dr. Ebony Cunningham Stringer, Rabbi Lydia Medwin, Acharya Fleet Mall. It feels like we are just beginning. We're always just beginning, aren't we? Thank you to each and every one of you, not only for your presentations tonight, but for the traditions that each of you represent, for the work that you represent, for the voices that you've brought into this space, to the great traditions, thousands and thousands of years old, whose wisdom still resonates and resonates now, and for asking and facing such such difficult questions, difficult theological questions, but also difficult challenges to the way that we live our lives and the way we act in the world. And I think that's what I'm taking away tonight is these conversations are incredibly granular, because I think they are at the heart of it, it's a personal call to each and every one of us. What is our spirituality worth? What does it mean? How do we enact it in the world? Is it going to stop at lip service, or is it going to move to building movement and community and facing what we see in the world around us? I want to raise up Dr. Jimmy Jones. We missed his voice tonight. It's an important voice. It's a vital voice. It's a voice that I've come to rely on and respect and be nourished by over the last many years. And our prayers again for his sister who passed tonight of COVID, and for his family and all those who have gone before her, and our prayers tonight for each and every one of you and your communities and all the incredible work you represent. May it see successes abundant, and many doorways open for each and every one of you, and may we all pass through them into that beloved community that we all not just imagine and dream about, but that we want to see here and in the hereafter. Thank you so much, all of you, and I'm going to hand you over back into the capable hands of Mapilo and his team. Thank you so much for convening us, and thank you for the honor of facilitating all of you tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, we want to thank you, Professor Malik, for such a smooth and effective job moderating. We definitely want to thank all our panelists, Acharya Mal, Rabbi Medwin, and Dr. Cunningham Stringer for these powerful, powerful presentations. One thing I want to point out, just to add a little bit of sentimental value, Dr. Fleet Mall was actually the very first speaker who agreed to be part of our conference. And so seeing him speak tonight for us really just feels like we're coming full circle with this whole conversation. So we just want to send a personal thank you and shout out to him. But of course, we would be amiss if we didn't also express our deep appreciation for Dr. James Jones and our sorrow for such a difficult loss. And our thoughts and our prayers and our support are going out to him and his family, and frankly, all others who have been affected from this pandemic. And we pray that everything will run smoothly as we transition out of this terrible, terrible time. We also want to add that this panel is brought to you in part by the generous support of the Yale Chaplain's Office, the Slifka Center for Jewish Life here at Yale, and also the Atlantic Union Conference of Seventh-day Adventists Department of Youth Ministries, Yale Divinity School, and the North American Division Department of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty. Again, without your support, none of this conference would be possible. We also want to say thank you to our team of interpreters for such excellent interpretation into Portuguese, Spanish, and ASL. Frankly, this is a committed team that is, oddly enough, although they've expanded the area to which we're able to broadcast, they've actually made our workload much, much lighter. Just the initiative that they take and their tenacity to work so hard. It's just very heartwarming, and we want to thank each and every one of them. So now we'll have Steve. He's going to tell us a little bit about what's happening tomorrow, and then also transition us, for those who are interested, into our networking session in just a few moments.
Thank you, Mpilo, and I just completely agree with everything he just said. Thank you so much to all of our incredible panelists, moderators, speakers in this evening session, and everything that we've had so far through the weekend. It has been truly inspirational. Tomorrow, starting at 10 a.m., we will have our student panel with an excellent team of student activists, so don't miss that. Then at 11:45 a.m., we'll begin a time of acknowledgments for all of the people and organizations who have made this event possible. This will be a time also to learn and to build your list of resources to take away from this conference. We're going to be including links to resources, links to organizations, to programs, lots of things that you can connect with to get further involved in this issue. So we hope to see you there. And then after that, finally, our last session of the conference will begin at 12:15 p.m. With the dynamic and knowledgeable Claudia M. Allen. You will not want to miss this presentation. It will be powerful. All of the presentations tomorrow will be using the same link, so hopefully the link confusion will end, and tomorrow will be a simple day. Before we part company, though, tonight, we invite each of you to join us in a short impromptu networking session starting as soon as we close this meeting tonight. The link is posted in the chat right now. And this will, it has also been emailed out to all registered attendees just about an hour ago. So this will be the time for you to meet with other people and to discuss the ideas that you've encountered so far in this conference. We'll be starting it right away as soon as this webinar ends. So jump right in and we will see you there. Also, just a reminder to stay connected with us after the conference. Don't forget to connect with us on Instagram at Yale ACF. Have a wonderful night.
We didn't tell our interpreter.